up for Sebastiaan, y'all.
Thank you. Awesome. It's really great to be here. So before I dive into this, it's been a really great day. I'd really like to just get some applause for all the fantastic organizers, the volunteers today who've put this all together, and of course you for being a great crowd here. It's awesome. Now I know it's been a long day, and you saw it on the session, on the schedule already, the last minute design thing. Like, oh boy, he's going to probably talk about the differences between Helvetica and Arial for like 30 minutes. Eyes are glazing over already. Now I made sure that all the content here is rated D for developer audiences. There's no design experience required in this. You'll be totally fine. So my name is Sebastiaan. I go by SDW online in a lot of places. And while I do some freelance design now in San Francisco, and I make an app with my friend and partner, Ben Sandowski, I used to work at Apple for a bit. And much like Ash, I'd like to kick it off with a bit of story time. So when I worked at Apple, it was an interesting time. We worked at Internet Services, and we were mostly responsible for the design of MobileMe transitioning to iCloud, the apps that had to do with that. And there was a particular new internal project we were working on, and it was super, super secret. It was radical and new. It was called Find My Family. Find My Family was a controversial project within Apple because it was a time where we didn't yet have as many social media apps that we have today, and especially not location-based apps. And particular people, especially senior management within Apple, thought it was kind of creepy. They were still of the generation where they thought the internet is a place where you don't really even use your real name. So sharing location, especially if it's a permanent and persistent thing, could be pretty scary. So it came to us as designers to figure out a way to make it seem more approachable, disarming, I would say even less creepy than it actually was. And in a way, that's actually what Apple has been doing for quite some time. I'm not sure if you recall these guys, but these adorable little things made computing so much more accessible to a lot of people. In fact, it was creepy and intimidating to step up to those big beige towers that used to be computers. These things were disarming, in a sense. And of course, Apple did that again. It really became their method. They got into their swing. The iMac gave them a great head start. It kind of saved them from almost certain demise. And what they did with MP3 players is they took the same approach. How do we make this very kind of intimidating thing, MP3, what are these acronyms? No, it's just the iPod. Songs in your pocket. Simple. Then came the really big challenge, the iPhone. Now, we all know the iPhone wasn't just a phone. It's not like they were going to take existing phones and put a nice candy-colored jacket around it. The iPhone was a pocket-sized computer. It was incredibly complex. And on top of that, it was Apple's first device that just kind of launched without any buttons. Now, of course, there's buttons on iPhones. There's still, to this day, buttons on iPhones, real buttons. But the main interaction method was not like the iMac's keyboard that was already known to people, not like the first iPod, which actually had buttons around that click wheel. No, there was an incredible amount of complex applications hidden behind essentially a pane of glass. So there was a real challenge there to try and bridge the gap between this world we live in every day, where there are wonderfully tactile things, everything from flipping through a book, picking up an object, mechanical keyboards, right? These are really wonderful tactile things. How many people here have these incredibly loud things that rattle the office every time you press? Yeah, there's people like that out here, I know. And I bet you also use an iPhone. And I bet you enjoy using an iPhone. So something incredible happened. The people that worked at Apple made an incredible bridge between the world of tactile sensations and this dead, cold glass that had no feedback whatsoever. Now, a lot of that was through engineering, hardware design, software design, et cetera, things I cannot comment about at all. And I'm not saying everything was to the credit of the designers, but design played a big role in it as well. We can look at the first iPhone, and it immediately stares you in the face what they did to make it tactile. This is the home screen. It had these beautiful, colorful, inviting icons. But the layout mirrored what the most simple phones back then looked like. Touch-tone phones with buttons in a grid. And they are just that. They're buttons. If you look behind all the incredible rendering in here, there's a method to that madness. They're convex. The shading makes it look like they kind of jut out from the screen towards you. You kind of want to press them. And that extended to the entire platform, all of the visual styles. If you look at the buttons, every single thing was carefully rendered. I love looking at these buttons looking back because you can see that back button has a little inset shadow. So at first it recedes, but the gradient also like raises it again. So it kind of feels like they're these like almost jewel inlaid buttons that just beg for you to press them. Now, when I got started with freelance design work, I worked for a lot of independent Mac developers. And of course, they jumped on the App Store as soon as it came out. And I started working for them, and that was my first sort of attempt at doing the same thing that those people at Apple did. They tried to make that tactile-looking interface, and I kind of played with that. This was a currency converter app I designed for Luc Vandel at Edovia. And we had more fun with it. I worked with my friend David Lanham, Andrew Kaz, and Phil Ryu, and we made this app called Classics. Now, our thing with Classics was, this is what ebook readers look like, right? Cool, super functional. You didn't have to carry a giant stack of books with you everywhere anymore. But the experience of browsing your books was just like going through Windows Explorer and black and white, just a list of files. And then you went into it, it was either scrolling black text or flashing displays of just, it wasn't a very satisfying experience. So we took Project Gutenberg books, put them on rich mahogany shelves, designed like these custom covers on them, and we even made it so when you flip the page, we're like, whatever, we'll make it look like the page is folding. The real effect was actually 32 PNG images of a rendered page and squeezing the content on it, so it was not very high fidelity, but it was kind of cool. It was nifty, and people were like, whoa, this is pretty neat. Of course, you probably have seen iBooks, which is what Apple was undoubtedly making in the meantime as we pushed our silly little app, and they did it way better than we did. But I always loved that version of iBooks, which was just so unapologetically tactile. It was really neat. And then, iOS matured, and things kind of went on like that. Suddenly, there was a wallet in your pocket that looked just like your actual plastic cards. There was a keynote where Scott Forstall announced the new Apple Maps. And you can see there's a trend happening here. You can still see those old buttons up there that I liked so much, those inlaid, jewel-like buttons. But this virtual road sign is not even interactive, but the rendering on it is crazy. It's got like little hexagonal reflective patterns. It's got like text effects. It's got 5 different shadow renderings below it. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff going on there. One day you woke up and you updated your iPad, and suddenly one of your folders was now wood, and there was like a magazine news standard, and the magazines were apps. Very interesting things were happening. Your podcast player would update, and it wasn't just album art anymore. No, behind the album art was a reel-to-reel tape player with real controls that were square for some reason. In fact, the music app, if you moved your iPad around, that little volume indicator there would actually, like, the reflections would alter and stuff. It was kind of wild, and I was like, why the wooden beams on the sides? Turns out there was a stereo designed by Dieter Rams that they based it on for some reason. And the best part about this is it really is not a very good stereo. Because you think that button on the right turns it on. It doesn't. One of those 3 knobs turns it on. You'd never guess it. It's beautiful to look at, but it's terrible to use. And then Contacts became a book like iBooks, but it's a scrolling list view. So it didn't work as a book, but it just looked like one. And then my favorite thing was you were playing all these games, and gaming was really taking off on iOS, so where do you check your high scores? Well, on a craps table, of course, with beautiful lacquered mahogany wood and golden tab bar icons, and your app icons are like crepes on a table. So it was during this time, sketching the picture, that we were working on Find My Family. And we were kind of running up against a conundrum. We had designed this app many times, and I'm telling you, like doing pixel-perfect mock-ups of it for design reviews. It got shot down all the time. We did crazier designs than that craps table that you saw. We had some really weird stuff. So one day, as we're really hitting our heads against the wall here, and management keeps shooting it down, a mystery person walks into our office. I won't name any names. There's NDAs in place for a reason. But a mystery person walks into our office, and he gives us a piece of material and says, just make it look like that. So we take the material, we render a couple different versions of it, and a few years later, I'm already gone with Apple. It takes a long time at Apple to develop some products. So in a keynote, when I'm already at a different company, I see my Find My Family is launched, finally, and it's now branded Find My Friends. And it's out, and I'm really excited to have it out in the world. There it was. All that hard work, finally realized, finally finished. So I'm, of course, very excited to see what the world thinks of it. So Gizmodo goes first. All right, maybe Fast Company, that's a good design. Oh, tacky software design philosophy. I love that he specifically called out fake leather. I mean, it was real leather we based it on. Right, it becomes Apple's chief of all human innovators. No more stitched leather. And it became kind of this banner. You know, everybody was unifying against, like, come on, enough with all that stuff, especially the leather. And I was like, oh, boy. And it even got on Quora, which is my favorite question on Quora of all time. What does stitched leather have to do with finding my friends? And Emma says, oh, nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with finding your friends. What was that, Emma? Nothing. It's ugly. It's tacky. And this man is not related to me. I don't even know where they got that image. So it was rough, you know, the kind of thing that you do take a little personally, but I was still happy with the work we did. I got to work with some really amazing people, and you know, times change, and designs are not something that are sort of irrevocably linked to your person forever. It's not like people will be able to find these things. Anyway, moving on. These kind of movements, they come up. These are trends in design. They come up, and they to pass. And of course, it passed. We all know iOS 7 came out and it changed everything forever. So that's how we kind of created a dimension of tactility in apps. So now what do we do? Trust me, as designers, we certainly felt that way. It was like, whoa. Well, for one, we do have to take a look at how radically it changed. I mean, we had those really candy-like buttons and stuff, and this was the first version of iOS 7. And now that you all have modern phones with iOS 11 and 12 on it, you'll notice they actually brought back the buttons, kind of, the button shapes, and it made it a bit more interactive. They backpedaled a little bit, but still, we're still here with that question on how are we going to cross that chasm? How do we make stuff on glass slabs seem tactile? I'm going to avoid that question. We're going to all just download Photoshop at adobe.com. It's got a 14-day trial. If we work really fast, we'll go through the fabric first, basic birch, mahogany later, if we have time, leather, and then felt. Felts takes a bit of time because the inlaying and the combining with wood is really difficult. No. OK, we're going to do an 2018 proper edition of making tactile user interfaces. And because you do want to see some credentials, I just made an app with my partner, Ben, and it's a camera app for iOS. It just came out a year and a half ago. It features no such leather or anything, but it was a very interesting challenge in making something tactile, because what is more tactile than a camera, am I right? Cameras are so satisfying and tactile. So let's go back to the pivotal moment. What replaced luscious textures and dimensional designs in UI design as a flourish, as a way to kind of like easily bridge that gap? Well, very easily, animation became a thing. So animation can be just as over the top and, dare I say it, useless as visual treatments can be, because nobody wants this in a tab bar. Okay, your finger's over it, for crying out loud. But there's things like very dry things like lifts on. This is actually Waze's onboarding. This is beautiful. Not only does it illustrate the points you're trying to make, it is stateful, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It makes a really dry something kind of engaging so people pay a bit more attention. That's what you want. But it goes down to the lowest parts of iOS from the get-go. Animation is the special thing of the iPhone, and it only became more important with iOS 7. Why? Because we have this wonderful thing where the animation in something as simple as a list view adheres to the basic laws of physics. So if you start pushing something, it gets momentum. If I were to take this water bottle right now and I would throw it at the end of the room, someone would be really mad at me. But it would also be very weird if it just kept going at a constant line and then hitting the sound and image guides at the top. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, you can see it here with the scrolling animation that doesn't have that momentum. It feels, ugh. Oh, it's like nails in a chalkboard, am I right? It's terrible. So why is this? Why is this so unsatisfying, and why is it so special what Apple did there? It's like the uncanny valley. You're probably familiar with it. If you have a robot like Wall-E, very explicitly robotic, it can be cute. And if you have a robot that looks exactly like a person, you know, that's fine. We can interact with that. If you get to that sort of kind of human but something is off thing, you think, this thing is going to wear my skin tonight. And it's not fun. Now, we don't have quite that level of creepiness with UIs, but we do have like sort of the fine heights where there's minimal to no animation. Think of like ATMs. Screens just change. Maybe they fade. Then we have the amazing iPhone thing where stuff has physics and you toss it around. It feels really good. And then in between is the awful valley where it tries to do that, like those infotainment things on the back of like airplanes. And you scroll, you're like, ooh, terrible. I recommend all of you watch this session by Chan and the other people at Apple that built the iOS 10 gestural interface. It is so adherent to physics. It's wonderful. They made sure to explain how they did it and why they did it. And you can see it yourself. You just multitask, and you push it up, and it hits like a nice solid limit. There's a bit of a bounce. There's a bit of firmness. Everything behaves the way it should. So when you're doing animations, keep this wonderful line from The Simpsons in mind. Go ahead. There we go.
Lisa, get in here. In this house, we obey the laws of thermodynamics.
I think that's such a great. In this house, we obey the laws of thermodynamics. So yes, animation, great, awesome, definitely use it. But obey physics. If you're going to animate something, and there's a state in it that the user interacts with, make sure that it feels coherent with the way the world around us works. Also very important, be quick. Nobody wants to wait around to see your animation. I'm sure it's really cool. Make it fast. Never, ever, ever use gratuitous animations. And then make it natural. And this sounds a little bit like make it quick or physics or whatever, but it's not. And the reason is there's all these guidelines. There's the human interface guidelines from Apple. There's IBM. All sorts of companies have different guidelines for animation. They're great. They'll even define spring rates, that kind of stuff. Guidelines, schmidelines. I have a friend of mine who is a great animator, and he says it's a wonderful thing. Don't trust the number. Trust your eyes and feelings first. You can bend the rules of reality. Motion is an illusion, and you get to be the magician. So play with it a little bit. You know, you gotta get a feel for it. Just change the values. Don't just take what people say you can do. Change it a little bit. Play with it. Thanks, Pascal. I said, thanks, Pascal.
You're welcome, Sebastiaan.
He's a good guy. So we did something like this. We tried to keep people a little bit engaged with our onboarding process with Halide, because you want to take some photos with it. How do we not make it like 4 screens you have to kind of quickly thumb through before you can take shots? Well, what we did is cameras came with manuals in the past, especially Polaroid, like simple cameras. And so we made it look just like a real manual that you could really leaf through. And it was quick. You know, we added a skip button, so you can almost just skip it. But it was a nice, fun way to kind of engage people a bit more through something that was kind of dry. Altogether different, this is animation that we incorporated for flipping the camera. Now you can see 2 things here. One, the icon shifts and twists, which is just a fun flourish, and it's quick, it doesn't get in the way. But you can also see that it responds to touch, and that's why animation is a new texture. Now we show that interactivity through animations. The emanation, we actually make it so the icon scales down a little bit, so it feels like you're really pushing it into the screen. So there's your old button. Here's your modern button. If you want to make your modern button a little bit more engaging, maybe make it so you can actually press down on it. It's fun. Makes a huge difference. And to see how big of a difference it makes, check out what the Apple Watch does. Sorry for the cursor, but you can try it yourself. If you have an Apple Watch, everything satisfyingly pushes down. You don't even notice it most of the time, but it makes a big difference. It makes it feel more tactile. So that's what we did with our shutter button, too. There was no guideline for how a shutter button should respond in a camera app. We just played with it until it felt really good. It was really cool. I was at a conference once, and a girl came to me and said, man, that shutter button, it was so damn satisfying. How do you make it so satisfying? That's the greatest thing I could have ever heard. Such a simple thing, but if you tweak it a little bit and you put some work into it, it can be really tactile. Oh, there's one more thing. Look at this really cool animated slide. Stop. Make your animation responsive. Nobody wants to be strapped into a roller coaster. This is what your users are going to look like if you make a really long animation and you can't do anything about it. iPhone 10 is amazing about this. Yeah, it's going to be either terrified or just that. That's me, usually, especially that kind of stuff. iPhone 10 is great about this. You can even interact with the app as it is opening. Often you can tap widgets, tap controls. It'll totally work. So animation is one of the best ways to make a tactile, delightful user interface. Fun to work on, too. Then there's still the good old visual treatment. Still a thing to create a more tactile user interface. And don't just think about color and texture here. One of the most basic things you could do are metrics, and it means the shape of things. Now, Apple has guidelines about how big a button can be, and it makes sense because nobody wants to control a car with a steering wheel this size. There's a reason things are the size they are. This is actually a real thing. It is a tiny mini steering wheel for a particular truck to steer your trailer. Oh, I love it. It's so cute. But I'm not talking about making your controls really small. Of course, you've got to make sure you can tap them. But what about making them bigger? You totally can. Nobody says you can make your controls Can't make your controls the size of the screen. Well, there's probably a guideline against that, so don't do that. But Maps is brilliant at this. They figured you're walking around, you're busy, I'm a tourist in New York, and want to see the Empire State Building. The buttons are bigger. They're nice, hittable buttons, and it makes it so much more tactile. Metrics, on top of that, color. Color shows interactivity and helps you make something that seems easier to interact with. You can put up an app that is bare bones, hello world, black text, one word is blue. People will figure out that it's interactive. But if you use a different color scheme, try complementary or contrasting colors to enhance the feeling of interactivity. The shape of things matters. You have these luscious buttons. I'm sorry, I love these things. They're beautiful. Buttons are great. You can still make buttons look like buttons. Now, I hear you. This skeuomorphism. I thought it was gone, finally. No. A skeuomorphism is just that. Doesn't mean leather. It doesn't mean particular 3D finishes or something. Skeuomorphism just means like something looks like its real-life equivalent. In this case, a button in the real world, a button on my keyboard looks like a button. If a button in an app looks like a button, has a shape like a button, it's skeuomorphism. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Buttons go way back. We got this one. This one was nice. Like, look at that. It's some pretty good rendering. Looks like you can really kick that guy in. And computers got better. We get these nice soft touch plastic buttons. They're going to be started with these beauties. Oh, so nice. Love these. And then, we got the new phase of the new buttons stuff. But the reports of the death of buttons have been greatly exaggerated. They're not gone. They're here to stay. And look at all these fantastic apps. They all use buttons. Even Apple does it. Do as they do. Lyft has a wonderful one. It even ticks down a pixel. So if you press on it, it really feels like it clicks down a bit. It has a bit of haptic feedback. Twitter makes sure that it's explicit about the main action in the screen by using a big blue button. It reinforces the brand. It looks good. It gives an extra tactile dimension to it. And Apple, even in the Apple Store app, always shows the primary action in screens through buttons. Use them. It's OK. And then, of course, you put all that work into visual treatment and stuff. Now it really matters where you put stuff. Because phones nowadays are really big. I'm pretty sure this year we'll see the biggest iPhone yet. And that was a very, very big challenge when we made a camera app. Maps does this, again, brilliantly. Maps is such a good demonstration of UI. It's too bad more people don't use it. It's actually getting a lot better, too. The data set is getting good, but it's a thing altogether. It's great to interact with. You can use it completely with one hand, which is what you're doing when you're walking around. So think about your use case. Which we redesigned Halide for the iPhone X. We decided we have enough vertical real estate to now put every control right under your finger. It's perfect when you grab your phone. You want to take a photo, make some adjustments. Keep this map in mind. I drew a little sort of fantasy map of what your phone looks like. This is for righties, by the way. You just flip it for the left side and kind of use the overlap. But you got some nuisance deserts in the corners there. Oh, it's bad. Try that out. Put your thumb like that. Nobody likes that. The reachable plains are great. You have the frontier, and up there it's no hands land. Nobody wants to go there. Terrible. And I'm not saying put all your controls at the bottom. That's just not feasible. But if you prioritize your most important actions in your app, see if they are ergonomic. Are they in the right place? Is it a pleasure to use, or is it just kind of getting annoying? And that's how you make things visually tactile. Metrics, the shape of things, the color of stuff, the shape. Don't be afraid to use buttons. You can make them all sorts of shapes. And where you put them really matters. But I hear you say, Sebastiaan, buttons are old hat. We got rid of the buttons on our phones. Gestures are where it's at nowadays. I agree. I've seen some really cool gestures, and gestures are a really fun place to kind of explore interactivity and especially make things more tactile and delightful. Keep in mind, a lot of gestures fall in two categories. Either they're a consistent gesture, or they're a coherent gesture. I'm going to walk through how we figured out the sort of gesture system in Halide to control it, because it's a gesture-based app. And it starts with a problem which I like to call the camera problem. Cameras are great. They're beautiful. This is kind of like the ideal camera. Gorgeous, delightful object that's wonderfully tactile. And we all have cameras in our pockets already. Everybody has iPhones or Android phones. They take great photos, and yet cameras still exist. Why? Well, there's physical limits, right? Can't do that with a phone. You can see that in this thing, too. It's got a big old lens on it. That's a physical limitation. I can't solve that. I can't solve that. You can't solve that. But there are still point-and-shoots as well, and other small cameras people use. Now, a lot of that is technical reasons, but increasingly it's becoming that they're tactile and pleasant to use. They're much easier to use because they can just kind of map to your hands, and the controls are easier than a big slab of glass. So I thought, how can we redesign the camera on a phone to work kind of like that? So first, what is out there, right? So there's two classes of camera applications out there, the simple and the complex. And this is kind of how you go through figuring out if you should implement a gesture or not. How can you make a UI that works? Simple apps, best example of a simple app is the best camera user interface ever made, in my opinion, is the stock camera app. It's wonderful. If it doesn't just do automatically what you want it to do, you can tap on it and it'll figure it out. Sometimes it doesn't really figure it out. And then it gets a little frustrating. Who's had this happen before where you got like a leaf or something in front of a beautiful landscape, and you tap the leaf, and your phone's like, okay, he wants it exposed or in focus. I'm going to just do both. So the leaf is now wonderfully in focus, but it is completely blown out, the background, which is annoying, but hey, it's a one-dimensional interface. The phone can only get information from you with a one-dimensional point of interest. That's just the limitation of the interface. It's strong, it's powerful, it's simple, but it's limited. So what do the apps on the other side of the aisle look like? Complex applications. Those can be cool. Well, they all look like this. I mean, it was overwhelming even for me. I couldn't figure it out. And it brought me to a place where I was once when I was kind of looking like that, turning white in the face. And I was like, oh, God, what do? CSS Edit was an app that I picked up because I didn't know code. I didn't know CSS. It was hopeless, just terribly hopeless. And what CSS Edit for me did is it brought a really simple UI to a complex problem. For me, I could inspect a website. I could immediately click on something, see what style was applied to that or which styles, how it cascaded visually. And then if I changed something, it just changed. And in doing that, I figured out how these attributes work. I can write some CSS, see everything break. It's kind of how I still do things. I just break stuff. And then figure it out. And there's a name for bringing a really simple UI to a complex problem. It's called teaching. It's teaching you stuff. And I was like, oh, maybe we can do that. We can make a teaching camera. And that's harder to do than just slapping a steering wheel in front of all those controls and kind of still keeping them there. You have to kind of abstract away from existing interfaces and see how you can make them a bit more complicated. So the one-dimensional interface, excellent. How do we improve on that? Look to the physical world. Photography has been around forever. I mean, to be fair, these guys look old. Could also be Brooklyn today. I don't know. But let's pretend it is old. It's been around for a while. So let's look at how people do things in photography land. Oh, turns out there's a standard solution for controlling a camera nowadays. Look at the way people hold it. Two main controls, a dial on the top. You twist one way, up or down, for brighter and darker, a focus usually on the lens itself, to adjust focus to close and far. OK, that's a two-dimensional interface. We can make this work. Swipe up or down to make it lighter or darker. And you can immediately see it as opposed to a camera where you usually have to half-press a shutter. With focus, swipe left or right. And you can even make it so if you swipe all the way to the right, you probably want to autofocus. So where do we fall in between? Kind of both, I guess. Works out. Pretty easy to use. Now, what this gesture is physically coherent. It is coherent with a physical object and thus more understandable for people who are already familiar with it. And probably, more likely than not, something that's fairly logical and intuitive for us. If you want to make a gesture yourself, the first thing you have to wonder is, does it really make the interaction better, or am I just chasing something which I think is going to look really cool in a demo? Keep it in mind. Don't let it immediately stop the thought. Just keep it in mind. Is there a physical equivalent? Tinder took this really cool thing. Love this GIF. Yikes. Tinder took this really cool thing where, like, if you have cards, it's natural for us to swipe them back and forth, put them away, put them in different places, dimensionally rearrange them. Physical equivalent. It's coherent with physical reality. Very satisfying to use on top of that. Then there's the consistent gesture. You're all familiar with it. It is consistent with the rest of the UI. So if you take the pull to refresh, for instance, it is consistent with the rest of the UI because people tend to look up in a timeline, for instance, on Twitter, want to find new content. It's probably at the top. If you overscroll, what is the most likely action they're trying to do? They're probably trying to get new content. So if you put refresh there, that's helpful. It's consistent. It's so consistent, in fact, that people have now implemented in places where it doesn't make any sense. It's not like you're going to swipe up and a new email account shows up. But it's fine. At this point, it's become a vocabulary. It's in the vocabulary of gestures we use. So is there a genuine need? Do either of these things apply? Try to kind of go out there and see if there's something like that that could work. Great, make it. And by which I mean, just make it. Prototype it, make it. You really get an idea of the utility of a gesture until you kind of make it. And it's totally okay to fail. I did this terrible thing. We had this thing in the first version of Halide where if you swipe left or right on your images you just took, I figured if you just took 15 images, you want to see which one you want to add to your camera roll, which one you want to throw away. Swipe left or right for favoriting, and then swipe the other way to throw them away. It's like Tinder for your photos. Okay, you tell them from San Francisco. Yeah, so that didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because the consistency in UI dictated that if you swipe left or right, you want to see your other photos. And if you swipe right, it's a destructive action, it throws your photo away. It was a bit of a disaster, but you don't know until you try it. So, now lastly, another really important thing you can do to make your apps wonderful, delightful, and tactile is focus on accessibility. Here's a quote that comes to mind. The most tactile user interface is the one you can actually use and that most people can use. And there's tons of resources. Apple has so many. Our wonderful community has so many resources for it. It is a wonderful test of your design. You'll find out all sorts of things about your app and your user interface you never knew. On top of that, it's a competitive advantage. But on top of all that, scratch all of that. If you're not actively allowing people to use your application, you're actively denying them to use your application. It is an incredible thing to do. And Brent Simmons said it really well. I have to paraphrase him here, but he said, if you are lucky, one day you'll be old enough to need these features. So spend some time on that. It makes a huge, huge difference. So to summarize, tactile UI nowadays can be achieved through focusing on tasteful, well-executed animation, putting in some effort in visual design, and just look past texture and color. It's also like thinking about where things go. Making gestures that make sense because they're grounded in fundamental, familiar concepts to users. And focus on accessibility, because really, the more people that you allow to use your app, the greater it is. All that work you just did will be multiplied by how many more people can use it. And if you do all that, and your client or your user base is still not, appreciative in the end, well, you can always come see me for the right price and behind closed doors. I still do a bit of leather work. That was it. Thank you so much.